I don't think I'll ever forget that night. It was supposed to be just another Friday evening at the high school football game. Our team had lost, but no one really cared. For my friends and me, the game was just an excuse to hang out. We weren't exactly the school spirit type. After the game ended, we stood by the bleachers, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when someone, I think it was Mike, suggested we check out the woods behind the stadium. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, grinning like it was the best idea ever. "We'll just walk around for a bit. Who knows? Maybe we'll see something cool." It was dumb, but we were bored. And honestly, none of us wanted to be the one to chicken out. So, there we were, 6 teenagers, me, Mike, Sarah, Jess, Ethan, and Danny, heading into the woods with nothing but our phone flashlights to guide us. The woods had always been kind of a local legend. People said they were haunted, but no one could ever agree on the details. Some claimed to have seen strange lights. Others talked about hearing whispers. It was all just stories. At least, that's what we thought. At first, it was fun. We joked around, trying to spook each other by making creepy noises and pretending to see things in the shadows. But the deeper we went, the quieter it got. The trees seemed to press closer together, and the air felt heavier. I can't explain it, but it was like the night itself was watching us. "Do you guys hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. "Hear what?" Ethan replied, shining his flashlight in a slow circle around us. "I don't know," she said. "It's like humming." We all stopped to listen, but at first, I didn't hear anything. Then, faintly, I caught it. A low, melodic hum, so soft it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. It felt deliberate, like someone was trying to lure us deeper into the woods. "Probably just the wind," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep going." We should have turned back. Looking back now, every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but peer pressure's a hell of a thing. So, we kept walking. The humming got louder, and it wasn't just humming anymore. There was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and sweet, singing a tune I didn't recognize. It sounded close, but no matter where we pointed our flashlights, there was nothing but trees and darkness. "This is messed up," Jess whispered. She was clutching Danny's arm like her life depended on it. "We should go back." "Maybe it's just someone messing with us," Mike said, but his bravado was starting to crack. "Who'd be out here this late?" Sarah shot back. No one had an answer to that. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved in a way that made my skin crawl. It didn't walk so much as glide, its long limbs swaying unnaturally. Someone screamed, maybe it was Jess, maybe it was me, and we all froze, our flashlights trained on the figure. That's when it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was a woman's, soft and almost kind, but there was something wrong with it. It echoed, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The figure stepped closer, and that's when I realized it wasn't just tall, it was growing. Its shadow stretched and warped, its shape twisting into something that barely resembled a person anymore. I could see it more clearly now. A dark, towering mass with long, spindly arms and a head that seemed to tilt unnaturally to the side. Its face, if you could call it, that was featureless, just a smooth, black void that seemed to suck in the light from our flashlights. "Run!" someone shouted, breaking the spell that had kept us rooted in place. And we did. We ran like our lives depended on it, which, looking back, they probably did. The woods were a blur of shadows and branches, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The humming had turned into laughter, high-pitched and distorted, like it was mocking us. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like forever. By the time we burst out of the woods and onto the empty street behind the school, we were all gasping for air, our faces pale and our hands trembling. No one said anything for a long time. We just stood there, staring back at the tree line, half expecting that thing to follow us out. But it didn't. The woods were silent again, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell was that?" Ethan finally managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," Mike replied, his usual confidence completely gone. "But we're not going back there. Ever." We all nodded, too shaken to argue. That night, we swore to each other that we'd never talk about what happened. But even now, years later, I can still hear that voice in my nightmares, asking the same question over and over. Why are you here? And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it again, that soft, sweet humming, drifting through the darkness. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting, and it knows we were there. It started innocently enough. The first day of senior year, and we were all sizing up the new kid, Craig. He seemed shy, maybe even nervous. When our teacher asked me to show him around, I agreed, not thinking much of it. At lunch, he sat next to me, barely touching his food but watching me like I was the only person in the room. It felt strange, but I brushed it off. He was probably just nervous about fitting in. After school, I saw him lingering by the bike racks. I nodded politely and kept walking, but when I turned the corner, I noticed him following me. His footsteps mirrored mine, quickening when I sped up and slowing when I did. When I finally reached my driveway, I glanced back, expecting him to turn toward his own house. But he just stood there, staring at me from across the street, not moving. I called out, asking if he was lost. He didn't answer. He just stared. That night, as I sat in my room doing homework, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I peeked out the window and there he was, standing under the streetlight, watching. The next day, Craig seemed normal, maybe even friendly. He waved at me in the hallway, and I thought maybe I had overreacted. But during lunch, he sat too close, asking invasive questions. Where do you live? What do your parents do? Do you hang out with anyone after school? The questions felt less like small talk and more like an interrogation. His smile never quite reached his eyes. After school, it happened again. He followed me. This time, I walked faster, taking a different route, but he was always just a few steps behind. I spun around and asked him outright why he was following me. He grinned awkwardly and muttered something about living nearby. It didn't make sense, or school drew kids from all over. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Craig. Hey, I found your number. Thought we could be friends. I hadn't given him my number. Alarmed, I blocked him, hoping that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Around midnight, I heard soft tapping on my window. My heart sank as I drew back the curtain. Craig's face was pressed against the glass, his grin eerily wide. The next few days were unbearable. Craig seemed to be everywhere I went. In class, he stared at me constantly. During lunch, he sat so close our elbows touched. If I tried to move, he followed. I tried talking to the teacher about it, but they dismissed it as new kid jitters. Then, things got worse. One morning, I found a small box on my porch. Inside was a note that read, "For my best friend." Beneath it was an old photograph of me playing soccer, something he couldn't have gotten without digging through my social media. I felt sick. That evening, I stayed late at school for a project, thinking I could avoid him. But when I stepped out into the empty parking lot, I saw him leaning against my car, waiting. My stomach turned as he walked toward me, holding something in his hand. It was another box. "You forgot this," he said, his tone unsettlingly calm. I didn't take it. I just got in my car and locked the doors. As I drove away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, standing motionless in the dark. I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. My parents thought I was being paranoid, but they didn't know the half of it. The next day at school, I avoided Craig like the plague. I skipped lunch and hid in the library, but somehow, he always found me. Then one afternoon, he crossed a line. I was walking to my next class when I felt someone grab my arm. It was Craig. His grip was firm, and his eyes looked wild. "Why are you ignoring me?" he hissed. I thought we were friends. I yanked my arm free and stormed off, my heart pounding. I told a teacher and they promised to look into it, but nothing changed. That night, my phone buzzed again. It was another message from an unknown number. "I'll always find you." Attached was a picture of me sitting at my desk in my room. My blood ran cold. I hadn't even seen him outside. My parents finally took me seriously and called the school. The next day, Craig wasn't there. I thought it was over. but I couldn't have been more wrong. A week later, the principal called me into his office. He assured me that Craig had been removed from the school and would no longer be a problem. Then he hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. "I think you should know," he said finally. "Craig has a history." Apparently, Craig had transferred from another school after multiple incidents. He had become obsessed with a classmate there too, following them home, leaving disturbing gifts, and eventually breaking into their house. The family had to file a restraining order. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. How had someone like that slipped through the cracks? I went home that day, relieved but still uneasy. I kept my curtains closed and avoided walking alone. For a while, things were quiet. Craig's number stayed blocked, and I didn't see him anywhere. But the sense of dread lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I started sleeping with the lights on, constantly checking the locks. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Craig wasn't the kind of person to give up easily. 3 months passed. Craig was gone, and life started to feel normal again. I let my guard down, convincing myself it was all in the past. Then one night I heard it, a faint scraping sound outside my bedroom window. My heart stopped. I told myself it was just the wind, but then I heard it again closer this time. Summoning all my courage, I peeked out the window. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty street and the swaying trees. Then, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows. It was Craig. He wasn't grinning this time. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He raised a hand and pointed directly at me. I stumbled back, panic flooding my body. I grabbed my phone and called the police, barely able to speak through the terror. By the time they arrived, Craig was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. The officer assured me it was probably a prank, but I knew better. Craig wasn't just trying to scare me. He was sending a message. He was still watching, and he wasn't done. A week later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps inside my house. My parents were out of town, and I knew I had locked every door. My breath hitched as I listened, frozen in my bed. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, the handle of my bedroom door began to turn. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and braced myself. The door creaked open, and there he was, Craig. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with a crazed intensity. "You can't ignore me anymore," he whispered, stepping into the room. I swung the bat, connecting with his shoulder. He cried out but lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. We struggled, the room spinning around me as I fought to break free. Somehow, I managed to grab my phone and dial 911. Craig realized what I was doing and bolted, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no trace of him. My parents came home immediately, and we installed security cameras, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Craig had crossed a line, and I didn't think he'd stop until one of us was gone. Craig was never caught. The police couldn't track him down, and eventually, the case went cold. But I never felt safe again. Every time I walked outside, I felt his eyes on me. Every creak, every shadow, every unfamiliar face filled me with dread. Months later, I found another box on my porch. Inside was a single note. "Miss me?" It was written in my handwriting, as if Craig had somehow copied it. The message was clear: he was still out there, still watching. To this day, I don't know where Craig is or what he's planning. I've moved twice, changed my number, even switched schools, but the fear follows me everywhere. I've stopped trying to explain it to people. They say I'm paranoid, that I should move on, but they haven't seen what I've seen. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard his voice or saw his shadow outside my window. I check the locks 3 times before I can fall asleep, but it doesn't help. Deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before Craig finds me again, and when he does, I'm not sure I'll be ready. It started with the janitor. No one really paid him much attention, was just the quiet man who shuffled through the hallways after hours, pushing his mop and humming a tune no one recognized. He was always there, always calm, always alone. But there was one thing we all noticed. He never, ever cleaned the East Wing hallway. It wasn't subtle either. Trash would pile up in that hallway: crumpled papers, broken pens, Even an abandoned backpack once said, but he'd just glance at it from a distance, shake his head, and walk away. If anyone asked him about it, he'd mutter something and change the subject. The older students whispered about him, calling him the keeper, but nobody knew what he was keeping. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'm not sure why. I guess I've always been curious about things that don't make sense. That hallway felt wrong even during the day. The tiles were cracked, the lockers were rusted, and the air was colder than the rest of the school. There were weird scratches on the lockers, too. At first, I thought they were just graffiti, but the closer I looked, the stranger they seemed. They weren't words exactly, just jagged shapes carved deep into the metal, like they were made by something sharp and angry. When I mentioned it to my friend Sarah, she just shrugged. "It's just an old hallway. They don't use it anymore," she said. Like that explained everything. Then she leaned in close and added, "But there's a story about it. You know, about the kid who disappeared?" I laughed it off, but her words stuck with me. According to the rumor, a student had gone into the hallway years ago, and no one ever saw him again. Some said he ran away. Others said he got lost in the crawl spaces beneath the school. The teachers denied it ever happened, but the janitor's strange behavior made me wonder if they were lying. A week later, I decided to find out the truth. It was after 9 p.m. when I snuck back into the school. The lights were dim, and the air felt heavier than it did during the day. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to the east wing. The closer I got, the quieter everything seemed, like the school itself was holding its breath. When I reached the hallway, it was even colder than I remembered. The lockers stretched out in both directions, their scratched surfaces glinting faintly in the flickering light. The carvings on them seemed to twist and shimmer, almost like they were moving. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my gut was screaming at me to turn around. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against metal. It was coming from the lockers. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. The sound grew louder, like something was shifting inside. I reached out to touch one of the locker doors, but before I could, it swung open on its own. Inside was nothing, just a dark, empty space that felt too deep, like it went on forever. Cold air rushed out, chilling my face, and I took a step back. That's when I saw a shadow moving inside the darkness. A hand shot out, pale and gnarled, its fingers impossibly long. I stumbled back with a scream as it clawed at the air, just inches from my face. The other lockers began to rattle, their doors creaking open one by one. I ran. I barely made it to the end of the hallway before I slammed into someone. It was the janitor. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. "What did you do?" he hissed, grabbing my arm. "I didn't do anything," I gasped. There's something in the lockers." He let go of me and glanced down the hallway. The lockers were still rattling, the shadows inside them growing darker and more twisted. The janitor muttered something under his breath, then turned to me. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This place, it's cursed." He told me the story as we hurried away. Years ago, a group of students had tried to summon something using an old book they found in the library. No one knew exactly what they'd done, but it went wrong, terribly wrong. The lockers became gateways, he called them, portals to somewhere else. The school had tried to seal the hallway off, but the things inside weren't gone. "They're just waiting," he said. I wanted to run home and never come back, but the janitor wouldn't let me. "It's too late," he said. "You've disturbed them. We have to seal it again." He led me to the custodian's closet, where he pulled out a bag of salt, a box of candles, and an old leather-bound journal. He handed me the journal and told me to read from it while he spread the salt in a circle around the hallway. The words in the journal didn't make any sense. They were in some strange language I couldn't understand, but as I read them aloud, the air in the hallway seemed to grow heavier. The shadows inside the lockers thrashed violently, and the doors banged open and shut. The janitor lit the candles and placed them at the corners of the hallway. "Keep reading," he shouted, as the ground began to tremble. With a final deafening roar, the shadows retreated. The lockers slammed shut, and the air grew still. The janitor quickly poured the remaining salt along the edges of the hallway, muttering a prayer under his breath. When it was over, he turned to me, his face lined with exhaustion. "It's done," he said. "For now." The next morning, the hallway was gone. In its place was a solid brick wall, as if it had never existed. I tried to go back to my normal life, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint rustling sounds, soft and distant, like they were coming from inside the walls. I still don't know what those things were, but one thing is certain: they're still there, waiting. I'll never forget the day Chester appeared. It was a normal morning, students bustling in the hallway, teachers rushing to their classes. Then he showed up. Chester was off. He had this piercing stare, like he could see straight through you. From the moment he walked into my class, I felt it. His eyes locked onto me like a predator finding its prey. The first time he spoke to me was during lunch. He didn't ask for my name or say anything casual. Instead, he said, "You need to come to the basement, tonight." His voice was calm, too calm, like he wasn't asking, he was commanding. I laughed nervously, but deep down, something didn't feel right. My friends brushed it off as a weird prank, but Chester wasn't joking. I saw it in his eyes. That night, when I got home, I received a Snapchat from an account with no profile picture. It said, "Basement, midnight." My hands trembled as I deleted the message. I didn't even know he had my Snapchat. The next day, Chester's fixation intensified. He didn't just look at me, he stared. In class, during lunch, even across the parking lot, he always knew where I was. My friends joked about how creepy it was, but I was terrified. He wasn't like the other students. He never joined group activities, and no one really knew where he'd come from. I asked my teacher about him, and she just shrugged. "New transfer student," she said. But something felt wrong. Chester wasn't new. He was unknown. One afternoon, I found a folded note in my locker. It wasn't signed, but I knew it was from him. It read, "The basement. Tonight. You won't regret it." My chest tightened. Why was he so obsessed with the basement? I wanted to ignore him, but every time I saw him, I felt this unbearable pressure, like he was silently daring me to defy him. That evening, another Snapchat came through. "If you don't come, I'll make you." I stared at the message, my blood running cold. He wasn't just weird anymore. He was dangerous. Chester's behavior escalated quickly. One day, I decided to confront him. "What's your deal?" I asked, trying to sound confident, though my voice shook. He just smiled. "You'll see soon enough," he said before walking away. That night, my phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't just a message. It was a photo of my house, my bedroom window to be exact. The caption said, "You're running out of time." My heart pounded as I locked every door and window in the house. How did he know where I lived? My parents were out of town, so I was alone. I tried to convince myself it was just a bluff, but then I heard it. A faint tapping at my window. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept toward the sound. When I pulled back the curtain, no one was there. But on the glass, written in condensation, was one word: basement. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every shadow felt like him, every sound like a warning. The next night, things took a horrifying turn. I woke up to the sound of footsteps inside my house. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards near my bedroom door. My breath hitched. Someone was inside. Slowly, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, but the call didn't go through. No signal. My only option was to hide. I slipped into my closet, clutching the bat from the night before. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my room. I held my breath, praying whoever or whatever it was would go away. But then, the door creaked open. Through the slats of the closet door, I saw him. Chester. He was holding a piece of paper, smiling that eerie smile. He placed the paper on my desk and left without a word. I didn't move until I was sure he was gone. When I finally unfolded the note, it said, "The basement is waiting." By this point, I was unraveling. Chester wasn't just a student. He was something else. Something wrong. The next day at school, I couldn't focus. Every hallway felt like a trap. Every shadow looked like Chester, but he wasn't there. For the first time since he'd arrived, he was absent. That should have been a relief. but it wasn't. It felt worse, like the calm before a storm. Then came the final message. Midnight. Basement. Or I'll come back. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to end this, to confront whatever awaited me in that basement. That night, I snuck into the school. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. I made my way to the basement doors, my hands trembling. They were unlocked. Of course, they were unlocked. As I pushed them open, a wave of cold air hit me. The darkness was suffocating, but I stepped inside. The basement was massive, its walls lined with old lockers and flickering lights. It felt like another world, one that shouldn't exist under a school. My footsteps echoed as I called out, "Chester?" No response. But I wasn't alone. I felt it. The air was heavy, charged, as if something unseen was watching. Then, I heard it. Faint laughter. It came from the far corner of the room, where a single light bulb flickered. As I approached, I saw a desk. On it were photos of me. At school, at home, even from years ago. My stomach churned. How long had Chester been watching me? Then I saw the enrollment records. His name wasn't there. Chester wasn't a student. He never had been. He'd slipped into our school unnoticed, blending in like a shadow. But why? And how? Panic took over. I grabbed the photos and ran, my heart pounding. But as I reached the stairs, the basement door slammed shut. The laughter grew louder, echoing all around me. "You can't leave," a voice whispered, though no one was there. I turned in every direction, but the basement seemed endless now, stretching far beyond its physical boundaries. Chester's face flashed in my mind, his smile, his eyes. I screamed, "What do you want?" The laughter stopped, dead silence. Then, the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who or what was there. I bolted up the stairs out of the school and into the night. My chest heaved as I reached my house, locking every door behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that Chester was still watching. The next day, I reported everything to the school. They searched the basement, but it was empty. No photos, no desk, nothing to prove my story. They told me I was imagining things, that maybe it was stress or a prank gone too far. But I knew better. Chester wasn't a prank. He was real, and he was dangerous. Days turned into weeks, but the fear never left me. I changed my routines, blocked every unknown number, even moved to a new house. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of him in a crowded street, in a passing car, or reflected in a shop window. Always smiling, always watching. The basement was just the beginning. Whatever Chester wanted, he wasn't done with me. And I knew, deep down, that he never would be. I never thought staying late to grade papers could feel so unsettling. At first, it seemed normal, just me, a desk full of papers, and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The school was deathly quiet, as it always is after hours. It's strange, isn't it? A place so full of life during the day can feel completely lifeless at night. The halls were still. The only sound was the distant tick of the clock on the wall. I like staying late sometimes. It gave me the peace I needed to focus. But that night, peace was the last thing I felt. It started small. You know, one of those little moments you brush off without thinking twice. I stretched my arms, glanced out of habit at the window to my left, and there it was. A faint figure, sitting right in the back corner of the classroom, reflected in the glass. At first, I didn't even react. My brain told me it was nothing to trick of the light maybe, but something about the way it sat there, so still, made my chest tighten. I froze for a second, staring at the reflection, waiting for my mind to catch up with what I was seeing. Then, I turned around. Empty, completely empty. Just desks and chairs, lined up neatly, exactly how I left them. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to make sense of it. I even chuckled to myself, shaking my head. "You're overthinking," I muttered under my breath. I turned back to my desk, determined to focus, but deep down I felt it. That quiet, gnawing sense that something was wrong. The next time I glanced at the window, the figure was still there, but this time, it wasn't just sitting, it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head. I froze, my pen slipping from my hand onto the desk. My eyes locked onto the reflection, and my chest tightened as I realized something that made my skin crawl. It was looking at me. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My body was rigid, my breathing shallow. I just sat there, staring at the window, hoping, praying it would go away. After a few long seconds, I mustered the courage to spin around in my chair. Nothing. The classroom was still empty. No one was there. But that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made everything worse. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I couldn't be. My hands were trembling as I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the fear. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself. "It's been a long day. Just finish up and go home." I tried to focus on grading again, but I couldn't. My eyes kept drifting back to the window, scanning for any movement. And then, I saw it again. The figure was clearer now, as if it had stepped closer to the glass. It wasn't sitting anymore, it was standing. Its blurred outline seemed sharper, more defined. I didn't know what to do. My instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I sat there, paralyzed, as the figure shifted slightly in the reflection. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't just standing there, it was watching me. This time I didn't even bother turning around. I didn't want to see the empty room again. The thought of seeing nothing behind me, but something in the reflection, was too much. I forced myself to pack up my things. My hands shook as I shoved the papers into my bag, my eyes darting between the desk and the window. I avoided looking directly at the reflection. I didn't want to know if it was still there. As I walked toward the door, I felt like I was being followed. The air felt heavier, colder, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I refused to look back. I just kept walking, one hand gripping the strap of my bag, the other fumbling with the keys in my pocket. When I reached the door, I paused for just a moment. I glanced at the small glass pane in the door, and that's when I saw it. The figure was right behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was closer than ever, its blurred outline looming in the reflection. I couldn't move, couldn't think. And then, just as I was about to turn around, I heard it. A faint whisper. I didn't wait to hear more. I yanked the door open and ran. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as I bolted toward the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. Even as I reached the parking lot and locked myself in my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never stayed late again after that. It was nearly dusk when I slung my backpack over my shoulder and left the school building, my sneakers scuffing against the pavement as I made my way to the bus stop. The campus was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that made the faintest sounds seem louder: the rustle of leaves, the hum of a distant car engine, the faint shuffle of footsteps that weren't mine. As I reached the edge of the parking lot, I froze. Across the street, a shadow stood still, the faint outline of a figure just visible beneath the amber glow of a streetlight. I squinted, but by the time I took another step, the figure was gone. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook my head. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just my imagination running wild. My school always felt different after hours, stripped of its usual noise and life. The hallways seemed longer, the corners darker, and the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make you doubt their reliability. Outside, the football field stretched into the distance, bathed in the golden light of a fading sun, while the parking lot became a wasteland of long shadows and empty cars. The stillness unnerved me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder far too often, as though expecting to see something or someone lurking behind me. Even the library, my favorite place, didn't feel safe anymore. The air seemed heavier, carrying an unspoken tension that clung to me no matter where I went. At first, I thought I was just being careless. My locker left slightly open, my water bottle knocked over on my desk, my phone shifting positions when I wasn't looking. But then, I started noticing patterns. Items went missing and reappeared in places I never left them, and one afternoon, I found a crumpled piece of paper inside my backpack with a faint, scribbled message. "Nice shoes." Asterisk. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself it was a prank, but deep down, I couldn't shake the gnawing unease. When my friend Katie told me about the rumor someone lurking near the school, Following students, I wanted to believe it was just that, a rumor. But that night, as I scrolled through my phone, my stomach dropped. There was a photo in my gallery of the school parking lot, taken from the spot where I stood earlier that day. I hadn't taken it. The first time I saw the hooded figure near the bus stop, I told myself it was just someone walking home, maybe a student I didn't recognize. But then I saw them again the next evening, standing just far enough away to blur into the shadows. They never moved, never spoke, and yet I couldn't help but feel their gaze burning into me. One evening, I worked up the courage to walk closer, but as I approached, they stepped back into the dark, disappearing as if they were never there. My heart raced as I tried to explain it away to a teacher the next day, but she brushed it off with a sympathetic smile. "These things happen," she said. "Don't scare yourself." But I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't just a coincidence. Determined to find answers, I started paying closer attention to the people around me. I noticed things I hadn't before. The janitor lingering too long by the gym, the math teacher's shadow always a step behind mine, a student sitting alone in the cafeteria but watching everyone else. My paranoia grew until it consumed every moment I spent at school. One night, as I left rehearsal, I heard footsteps quickening behind me. My pulse skyrocketed as I turned a corner, only to find the hooded figure waiting near the bus stop, closer than ever. I bolted without looking back, my mind racing with the realization that I couldn't keep running forever. Whoever they were, they wanted me to know they were there. I couldn't take it anymore. That weekend, I devised a plan. I'd stay late after rehearsal and pretend to leave, doubling back to hide in the shadows near the lockers. The school was deathly silent as I waited, my breathing shallow and my fists clenched. Sure enough, footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder until the hooded figure stepped into view. My blood turned to ice as they lowered their hood, revealing a face I knew all too well, Mr. Griffin, the friendly substitute who always asked about my day. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice low and uneven. "I just couldn't help myself." I backed away, my heart pounding as he stepped closer, the desperation in his eyes twisting into something darker. My scream shattered the silence, and I ran as fast as I could. Mr. Griffin was arrested later that night, thanks to the evidence I had gathered and the courage to report him. But even after he was gone, the fear lingered. Every shadow felt heavier, every empty hallway a threat. My friends and family rallied around me, their support a fragile comfort as I struggled to move past what had happened. The school tightened its security, but nothing could erase the memory of his eyes, his voice, the suffocating dread of being hunted. Even now, as I sit in my room, I find myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see him standing there. I've learned to trust my instincts, but I can't help but wonder how many warnings I ignored before it was almost too late.